Can people see that screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. I want to see you. Well, it's 94% less expensive than a workplace needs assessment. Yes, like, and we'll continue on that. So what I wanted to talk about for around 15, 20 minutes. Um, so organizations, we've mentioned already, they want to do better, but they don't know how. Where do I start? There are there's varying I'll just there's varying stages of where an organization is, and Sarah touched on the idea of the ERG groups as well today. Um, how do we get set up, or how do we not silo it? So I wanted to talk about what we have is a workplace inclusion maturity model. And this is really a way of how can we bring a data-driven process, policies, and practices into the organization. So you might have noticed from my enthusiasm, data and putting scientific metrics or metrics behind something is, I think, of real importance and real value. And so Jackie also mentioned the point there about universal design. And if people aren't so familiar with what that is, it's trying to design an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. And that comes from a Disability Act, it's just mentioned in there. So universal design is really about looking at the whole process and looking at everybody within the group, within the population that we're designing for. And on Lindsay's message there about we'll get Jackie back at 5 and we'll go through any questions she has, any questions you have there. I didn't get the book. And so what Jackie and those guys are doing as well, they're really trying to design the workplace for people with neuro minorities. But it's more than that. We have to design the workplace for people with sensory issues, with mobility issues. And when we take a universal design approach, we're asking those questions all the way along. And so some things that in ERG, so ERG is an employer resource group. A lot of people here today have employer resource groups for LGBTQ, maybe disability inclusion. Maybe you haven't started within your company to have one either. So they are voluntary, usually maybe 5 to 10 people, depends on the size of your organization. And you are trying to promote something within your company. In Sarah's talk earlier, she was talking about having a women, an organization promoting the voice of women, and it could be any other minority. In this case, we'll be talking about disability inclusion ERG group. And so what's really important is there's a lot of accessibility models out there, and if you Google it, you might find ones, and they're very much focused on digital accessibility and the WCAG guidelines. I'll mention a few things here about WCAG. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They govern mainly what you need to do in an online world. It's not really about the physical world. So it's really about your websites, your online footprint, digital platforms. But really what we want to do is look at all of the different stages within an organization that can be affecting employees. So what we have done is created a workplace inclusion maturity model to see where your organization is and where it needs to go in order to be more inclusive for hiring and keeping people with disabilities. And like Jackie said, keeping people with disabilities, it can increase with small accommodations, and it's much more cost effective for a company. And so what we need to do is set a benchmark in order to understand where we are. So we've identified 6 areas. Okay, there's so many aspects of different approaches in your company, but we've divided it into 6 different groups. Where you can analyze and understand each of these differently. So for example, the first one is the job application process. I mentioned earlier, some people said we only have 3 employees with disabilities out of 600. Okay, why is that? Is there a barrier? Is there something happening at the very beginning of the process in the application? What about the interview process, the onboarding and the training? Then we have the working environment. For example, is it accessible to somebody like Connor, who wants to be able to go to the canteen, who wants to be able to go to activities, but because he's a wheelchair user is locked out of that? Um, the area of disclosing needs and disabilities. Jackie touched on the point that the biggest problem with disclosing disabilities, is that the stigma around it. So there's a fear around it, and we're not creating an environment that offers welcoming support, but rather it could be a fearful place for people because they might lose their jobs. And then we also have another area, which is the access to supports, again mentioned by Jackie. And it can be that it can take up to a year. It's going to depend on your organization, the country that you're also in, whether you have the medical notes to declare that you do have a disability, or is it something that you have just self-identified? If you self-identified, perhaps HR are not going to take it seriously and are not going to give you an accommodation. I do know of a case where somebody had a problem with their eyesight, something they acquired, and it took 9 months for the organization, simply because of the procurement process within the organization. It took them 9 months before they could get a large enough screen so that person could continue to do their work. Yeah, you're right as well, Amy. People don't feel safe disclosing. But if you're going to disclose and nothing happens, then you're going to say, well, what's the point? Maybe I'll just leave. We see that causes problems for the organization again. So these areas, from if you're getting set up with an ERG group on disability inclusion within your company, or you're a smaller company and you want to just look at this, these 6 areas are really kind of good overarching to look at. But what I would say is, within the ERG group, it could be, let's say your company could have 1,000 people, but there's only 5 people in the resource group. It's not up to the individuals only in that resource group to do all the work and try and implement change. And so this is where the mindset shift has to happen. So within each one of these groups, the six things that I mentioned there needs to be interaction and engagement with other departments, as one department alone cannot solve for accessibility and disability inclusion. So if we think about the job application process, we've already mentioned that today. Reviews are needed across departments. So a review is needed with the UX design. It's with the communications or the hiring manager who wrote the job description. Engineering, as in from a digital perspective, how can the person upload their information? The hiring managers, is all the information correct? Human resources, and legal. So when we think about it, a job application that you might think, oh, well, the hiring manager writes it, sends it to design and engineering, and it gets posted. Actually, we need to be involving all of these departments in making sure the job application process is inclusive. I'll show you an example from the UX design and the engineering perspective. From the language use, a lot of companies still write things on their job descriptions, such as, oh, we're looking for a team player, or we are looking for a ninja. When we use certain language like a ninja or a rock star, they can be quite gendered language, and women typically wouldn't go for that. If we use descriptions like must be a good team player, when actually the role doesn't involve you having to work in a team, that might be that might be something that is actually off-putting for, that could be something that's off-putting for somebody who is neurodivergent, maybe somebody who is autistic and they prefer to work by themselves. So really looking at the description that you're putting there and questioning, is the language here easy to understand? Is the language here actually identifying what the role, what is needed in the role? Also, if you, some job descriptions might say, we're looking for a Swiss Army knife, meaning that you have to do multiple things. Well, if you are not specifying what those multiple things are, you can be causing anxiety for people who need specific instructions and they need to know exactly what they're going to be doing in that role. So there's multiple things there to be looking at. Same with the legal and the human resources. Should they disclose at this point? We have heard from Connor today that he has mentioned in his CV that he is a wheelchair user and he hasn't heard back from jobs. Should that disclosure be at this point? And is there legal ramifications for that as well? So from a web accessibility guideline perspective, and it's called the WCAG guidelines. It's I will share the link for them. They're very difficult to understand, ironically, but if you see a job application or anything on the internet, when we have a form to fill out, and there's no question above the box that you put your details, and it just says full name, nationality, email address, this form is not accessible. And the reason for that is, as soon as you type one letter or number into that box, you no longer see the information behind. And so you're putting cognitive load, you're making people think and remember. So you're asking people to remember what's in that box when actually they don't need to. So a more accessible way to have a form or a job application on your site is that you ask the question first and you can have it in the box as well. It's not necessary to be in the box, but what's very important is having the question beforehand. So that means that your designers need to look at that and your engineers also need to make sure that those boxes for screen readers are easily tabbed. Tomorrow we will be speaking with a lot more designers. Placeholder text is not read by screen readers either. Yes, absolutely. And so tomorrow we're going to be speaking more with designers, UX, product managers, engineers, more on digital accessibility. So if you haven't registered for tomorrow, do as well. So other areas of consideration, just looking at the job application process here, the need for testing. Some jobs still will have psychometric tests. Do people have to do them? Is there an alternative? This might cause anxiety. Is it specifically needed for the job? And I think that's really important to identify if things are required. Does someone have to do a maths test if it's a communications job? You know, providing questions in advance of the interview. There's been a lot of talk about this recently. Some people saying, if you do this, people will just prepare their answers with ChatGPT. And then, but you know what? That's okay. Like some people struggle with communication, some people struggle with thinking on the spot. If they have an opportunity to prepare their answers beforehand, but their answers are connected to their personal experience and their skills, that's what you should judge it on, not the fact that they prepared their answer. And the location, can it be conducted online? We heard from Erin today, who is hard of hearing, and having an in-person meeting could be more difficult for her because she can't rely on captioning within that. Yeah, and so there's a lot of questions that you can break down across all of these things. And this is what we're bringing in the workplace inclusion maturity model, a systematic and structured way to help companies be able to question what is required at each of these steps, what departments do I need to engage with, and how can we ensure that each of these stages are more inclusive. And so what we have is 3 stages. You won't see a gold standard here because I don't think any company will ever be, getting a gold, because it's always going to be a work in progress. Everybody with a disability will always say, this is my experience. It's not the experience of somebody else. You need to ask them. And so what we have created then is a 3-stage process where you can say, okay, maybe we're at the beginning of our journey, we're taking action on accessibility. Stage 2 is optimizing, and stage 3 is achieving. We're doing much better, and I'll break it down into each one of these next. What this means, these badges, let's say the first one, taking action, for any company that is engaging in the workplace inclusion model, they would have the opportunity to be able to put that badge on their website. And what that's going to mean for somebody like Connor, for someone like Erin, for someone with neurodivergence, it's going to show that actually we are an employer that is open to hiring people with disabilities because we are taking action now. We don't have everything fixed. We don't have everything sorted because that's tough, but we are aware of our limitations and we are doing something to overcome that. And so that's like something Connor said, is be honest about your facilities. If you don't have it in place, let me know, but maybe we can work towards that. So showing potential candidates that you are taking action on something means that, okay, the mindset is starting to shift in this organization. It also might make it more welcoming for people to be able to disclose their disabilities if they're already in your organization. And so looking at the taking action, what does that mean in that stage? It means that your ERG group or whoever is responsible for promoting inclusion is setting up these initial benchmark reviews across those 6 divisions. You're creating strategic plans for reviewing, for evaluating what's happening now. You're starting to bring in training and mentoring and coaching for your teams, from UX design, engineering to legal, because it's not, this has to be across the organization. And the time to change at the beginning can be very long. So for example, it might still be taking 9 months to get an accommodation request approved, or a ramp or something else. But the fact is, you're taking action. Moving into stage 2 means you're optimizing. Okay, we've done our initial reviews. We know where our limitations are. We know what we have to put in place. And now we've started to create our roadmap. So we have, not all, but we have some processes in place where we are sure that our job application process, for example, is a little bit more inclusive. We have more structure for teams to follow. And that could be that the engineers and the UX designers are following guidelines for the digital inclusion. And the EU Accessibility Act is coming into force in June 2025. So not too far away. And maybe other teams, the hiring managers, are starting to put in accommodations or just ask questions in their emails when they're hiring candidates. And the time to change is not perfect, but it's improved. Rather than waiting 9 months for something, maybe people are waiting 6 months. Still not great, but it's improved. And to be stage 3, in that you're achieving accessibility and inclusion across not everything, but across different aspects of the company. Now we can say that there's accessibility processes embedded within the systems. So within our hiring process, we ask candidates about the location, we ask about accommodations, and we respect them and we put them in. We have more knowledge across departments. So it's not just that the 5 people in the ERG group have to do this all by themselves. Training has been delivered for the UX department, design department. Training has been delivered for the legal department. And the time to change has gone from 9 months maybe to 3 months or less. And that can take a long time. And that depends on the process. What we also saw was a lot of accommodations can be done for free. And so there's a lot of things that can be put in there early and easily at no cost to make sure that some of those policies and practices are more inclusive for people with disabilities. So through Leaders for Accessibility, through the network, and this workplace inclusion model, what we have prepared then is that systematic, structured support where you get, let's say, an account manager, could be somebody like Connor, somebody where you have regular check-ins with the voice, with people with the voice of lived experiences to try and think about processes from their point of view. So you get check-ins with specialist coaches so that you can try and just push the agenda forward. For a lot of ERG groups, if the focus isn't there, or there can be burnout, but it's really about putting the mindset shift across the organization and seeing how can we work together. I mentioned earlier that an employee experience manager didn't want to engage in our accessibility webinar because accessibility was the role of the person with the title accessibility engineer. And that's kind of a barrier on the mindset rather than trying to make it more inclusive. So if you are interested in finding out more about maybe bringing that workplace inclusion model into your organizations, then you can reach out to me. And we can set up a call. We can find out what is working at your organization, what challenges you're having at your organization. And what we do is really connect you with the specialists across those departments: design, engineer, legal. We have great people in legal design, bringing that mindset shift across all of the departments, because it's not just on one person. It's really kind of a collective. I think the only way we can push agenda forward is if we all have a collective, and I like to think of it as a sprinkling of accessibility and inclusion mindset across the organization, rather than just say, okay, here's one person, you have to change the whole thing. And if we look at what has happened recently with diversity and inclusion specialists, they are being let go from organizations. Companies are pulling back on the budgeting, on the spending, on DEI. And actually, if everybody across all departments has knowledge and awareness of accessibility and inclusion, we don't particularly need one person to lead it, because it would become more embedded into the system and more embedded into the workflows and practices there. So if anybody has any questions on that, do let me know, and I will wrap up my talk there, and we will